Okay, more Wayside School, getting it done so you guys can listen to it before next Friday and take the AR test. This is chapter 21, Breathe. Stephen stared at the clock on the wall. What if he couldn't lift the mallet? What if he dropped it on his toe? What if he dropped it on Mr. Kidswater's toe? He could be expelled. Breathe, said Jason from the desk next to him. Stephen took a breath. He stared at the clock. What if someone left a skateboard on the stairs? Then he might trip over it on his way to the gong. If he broke his leg, Mr. Kidswater would yell at him for being late. Breathe, said Rondi from the desk on his other side. Stephen took a breath. He stared at the clock. Sometimes it seemed the hands didn't move at all. Other times he'd blink and it would be half an hour later. Time didn't always make sense at Wayside School. For lunch, Miss Mush made pepper-only pizza. Stephen ate a slice but did not remember eating it. His only clue was that he was very thirsty and his tongue and lips burned. He returned to his seat in Mrs. Jewell's class. He stared at the clock. Jenny was late coming back from lunch. Sorry, Mrs. Jewell, she said. I can't find my skateboard. Oh no, Stephen shouted. Are you all right, Stephen? Mrs. Jewell asked him. Why did he have to pick me? Stephen moaned. If you didn't want to do it, why'd you raise your hand? Asked Mac. Everyone else had their hands raised, Stephen explained. I mean, I guess I was excited about it at the time, but now you have cold feet, said Mrs. Jewell. Yes, exclaimed Stephen. He wondered how Mrs. Jewell knew that. His feet felt like 2 blocks of ice. No wonder she was a teacher. But what did his frozen feet have to do with ringing the gong? Breathe, said Mrs. Jewell. Stephen took a breath. Mrs. Jewell's class always had music on Friday afternoons. I'm sorry we don't have musical instruments today, she announced. They were sent out to be cleaned, and we haven't gotten them back yet. What if the gong was being washed too? Would he have to bang it on a different day? Breathe, said Kathy. Stephen took a breath. So just use what you were born with, said Mrs. Jewell, and a 1 and a 2. Dana loudly blew her nose. Ron twiddled his lips. Mac puffed out his cheek and popped it with a flick of a finger. Calvin and Bibi whistled. Joe stood on his head and sang jingle bells. Paul pulled Leslie's pigtails. She shrieked, squealed, or squawked, depending on the pull. Stop the music, Mrs. Jewell suddenly shouted, and the room became instantly quiet. Stephen, you're late, she told him. I'm sorry, I was so carried away by the music, I didn't notice the time. Time, Stephen, said Stephen. Now, Stephen, said Mrs. Jewell. He remained frozen in his chair. Mrs. Jewell asked Jason and Rondi to help. They moved to either side of Stephen and slowly lifted him to a standing position. It's time, buddy, said Jason. Time, Stephen repeated. He took 1 step, then stopped. Now the other leg, said Rondi. He took another step. You can do it, Stephen, cheered Kathy. Bang that gong like no one ever banged it before, called Joy. Stephen walked across the room. He stepped out the door. Behind him, he heard the entire class shout together, Breathe! Stephen took a breath. Chapter 22, The Moment. There's the gong. Stephen was worrying his way down the stairs when suddenly he spotted Jenny's skateboard right in the middle of a step. He stepped over it. Well, that was easy. And just like that, his fears vanished. Not even the cloud of doom worried him. He quickly hurried the rest of the way down. He didn't want to be late. When he reached the 2nd floor, he could see Lewis below, wheeling the gong into place. Lewis, he shouted, and then jumped down the final 8 steps. Am I late? You're right on time, said the yard teacher. The gong was gigantic, almost twice as big as Stephen. He had never stood so close to it before. In the center was a small red dot. The iron mallet hung from a hook. The mallet was longer than his arm, and thicker, too. Have you been doing your push-downs? Lewis asked. Stephen nodded. I'm almost up to 2, he said confidently. Mr. Kidswater stepped out of his office. He took 1 look at Stephen and asked, Who are you? This is Stephen, said Lewis. You chose him to bang the gong today. Him? Why would I choose him? Because you're the best principal ever, said Lewis. Well, yes, that's true, said Mr. Kidswater. I'll do my best, sir, said Stephen. That's what worries me, said the principal. Lewis handed Stephen 2 cotton balls. As Stephen was stuffing them in his ears, Lewis unhooked the mallet. He held it out to Stephen. Stephen wobbled as he took the mallet with both hands. Lewis helped him raise it to his shoulder. Mr. Kidswater checked his watch and then started the countdown. 10, 9, 8. He had to shout the numbers so Stephen could hear him through the cotton balls. 7, 6. Stephen tightened his grip on the handle. 5, 4. Stephen groaned loudly as he slowly raised the iron mallet up his shoulder. It was a good thing he'd been doing all those pushdowns. 3! Stephen staggered, but maintained his balance. 2! He concentrated on the red dot. 1! He swung with all his might and missed. He didn't just miss the red dot, he missed the gong. Lewis jumped out of the way as the weight in the mallet pulled Stephen around in a circle. The second time around, the mallet banged into the gong right on the dot. Gong! Despite the cotton balls, the sound echoed inside Stephen's skull and rattled his bones. It traveled up the stairs all the way to the 30th floor. He did it! Shouted Mac. Yay, Stephen! Yelled Jenny. Everyone in Mrs. Jewell's class whooped and hollered. Lewis kept Stephen from falling over and took the mallet from him. He hooked it to the frame, and then he and Stephen wheeled the gong into the principal's office. Mr. Kidswatter was already there, standing by the door. The principal held out his big hand and said, "Well done, Stephen." In the history of Wayside School, Stephen was the only kid to ever shake Mr. Kidswatter's hand. In the future, whenever Stephen feels worried or frustrated or just plain sad, his mind will take him back to the moment the mallet struck the gong. He will close his eyes and see the red dot. His hands will feel the weight of the iron mallet. He will hear the sound of the gong bouncing back and forth between his ears and will feel the vibrations in his bones. And he will smile. Chapter 23. Blame it on the cloud. Look at this. Chalkboard. Discipline. Everyone's name. Mrs. Jules went from desk to desk as she handed back the arithmetic test. "I am very disappointed in you, Joy," she said. "You need to learn your 6s and 7s. Joy had gotten an F. That awful letter was written in red ink, and there was a circle around it. "But it wasn't my fault, Mrs. Jules," Joy complained. "It's a cloud of doom. It made me change my answers." Said Mrs. Jules as she took another look at Joy's test. She made 2 little strokes with her red pen, changing the F to a B. Joy smiled. The door swung open and Bebe walked in more than 15 minutes late. "Bebe, you need to put your name on the board under discipline," Mrs. Jules told her. "Don't blame me," said Bebe. "I left my house on time. The cloud of doom slowed me down." "Oh, okay then," said Mrs. Jules. Leslie screamed. Mrs. Jules turned. "Paul pulled my pigtail," she accused, "both at the same time." "Paul, what did you have to say for yourself?" demanded Mrs. Jules. Paul shrugged. "Cloud of doom," he tried. Leslie turned around and shook her fist at Paul. "I'll doom you, you ugly bug sniffer." "Leslie, that's no way to talk," said Mrs. Jules. "It wasn't me, Mrs. Jules," Leslie said sweetly. "The cloud of doom made me say it." "Well, apologize to Paul for calling him ugly." "But I didn't call him ugly," said Leslie. "He sniffs ugly bugs." Jenny and DJ laughed. Mrs. Jules glared at them. "Cloud of doom," they said at the same time. Mrs. Jules continued to hand back the test. "You can do better, Terrence," she said when she came to him. Terrence crumpled his test into a ball and brought it to the front of the room where he dropped it into the trash. He stood there a moment, staring at the trash basket. "Terrence, return to your seat," ordered Mrs. Jules. He stayed where he was. "Terrence, do you have a problem?" asked Mrs. Jules. "No," said Terrence, "no problem." He kicked the basket. It sailed end over end across the classroom, spilling trash along the way. Mac raised both arms like a football ref. 3 points, he declared. "Terrence," exclaimed Mrs. Jules. "Sorry, the cloud of doom made me do it," said Terrence. "Mac," said Mrs. Jules, "you know better." "Cloud of..." "Enough!" shouted Mrs. Jules. "I get it. It's hard with that cloud hanging over us all the time, but you can't blame it for everything that goes wrong. You have to take responsibility, and that means working extra hard so things don't go wrong. So I'm doubling all your homework." "That's not fair," complained Benjamin. Mrs. Jules told Benjamin to write his name on the blackboard under the word discipline. "The ultimate test will start Monday," Mrs. Jules declared. "It will take 3 days to complete, and you better be prepared, cloud or no cloud." There were lots of groans. Mrs. Jules returned to Joy's desk. She crossed out the B and this time gave her an F-. "Terrence, there's a broom in the back closet. I want you to pick up the trash basket and sweep the floor. Mac will help you. Everyone else, get in line behind Benjamin and write your names on the blackboard under discipline." There were more moans and groans as everyone rose from their seats. "Except you, Todd," ordered Mrs. Jules. "You're the only one who's been good." Todd sat back down. He scratched his head. You used to be a nice teacher, said Rondi as she made her way to the blackboard. Why are you so mean? Asked Allison. Mrs. Jules just shrugged and said, Cloud of doom. Above them, the dark cloud continued to churn as it turned itself inside out again and again. No one hardly noticed it anymore, but it continued to grow larger and more powerful every day. Lightning flashed inside the cloud where no one could see it. Thunder boomed where no one could hear it. What happened in the cloud stayed in the cloud. For now.